Hi guys, and welcome back to Macaron. I'm Joanna, and in this video I'm going to try making a DIY paper clay and comparing that to store-bought brands. This was inspired by my best and worst airdry clay review, which was surprisingly popular, so I've linked that down below and you can check it out if you haven't seen it yet. And be sure to watch until the very end for a bonus tutorial on how to make this adorable koala macaroon. If you love crafting and want to see more unique DIYs like this, then please subscribe to Macaron and my other channel, Cute Life Hacks. And don't forget to join my Insta fam and Snap squad if you want to be the first to know when new videos go up. I always love replying to people who leave early comments under my videos, so that's literally the best way to chat with me. So now without further ado, let's get started with the experiments. In this video, I want to try out Daiso Clay, which has obviously gained a huge popularity through the slime community, and this brand new paper clay from China, which is sold through banggood.com. Just like the first video, we're going to be testing how well you can mix color into the clay, followed by how easily you can texture the surface, and lastly, how thin you can spread the clay, also known as the flower petal test. This video is kindly sponsored by banggood.com, and you can find the shopping links and a discount code for this Chinese paper clay below. First up, we have Daiso Clay, which is used everywhere in the slime scene. However, I've never actually seen many people try sculpting with it, so no one really knows how good this clay is when used for its intended purpose. Daiso Clay has this incredibly unique texture that crumbles into small fluffy pieces. The one thing I'm not a huge fan of is the packaging, because this clay dries up extremely easily after you've opened it. Even though Daiso Clay is obviously quite cheap to buy, it's still disappointing to find that your clay has completely dried up when you are hoping to use it again. In direct contrast to that, this Chinese brand paper clay comes in pretty amazing packaging. You have a fully airtight jar with another layer of plastic inside to prevent moisture from escaping. This is particularly useful when your clay gets smaller, since air pockets inside the jar can also cause it to dry up. You also get a ton of clay with this brand, which is great since the packaging means it won't dry out if you can't use it up all at once. Now let's move on to the first test, which is mixing color inside. I personally love using white clay because it's so easy to add your own colors using acrylic paint. As usual, I'm wearing rubber gloves to prevent the paint from getting onto my hands. While mixing everything, I noticed something pretty strange. The clay started to stick to my gloves, almost like it was melting, which is something that's never happened before. I think something in the rubber might be reacting to it, so I decided to mix the rest with my bare hands and didn't have any problems. But on the whole, it's not a bad clay, so it's time to move on to the next test. My favorite texture experiment is to create macaron feet. This really determines whether the clay is good at holding its shape, how well you can soften it with water, and whether it cracks or crumbles easily. To do this, I'm simply placing some plastic wrap inside an egg cup, adding some clay inside, and then popping it out. Then cover the clay with plastic and gently press the macaron flat using your palm. Right away, you can see that Daiso Clay cracks too easily. This can be partially fixed with water, but it's still quite tedious working with very dry clay. To make the macaron feet, draw a line about 3 mm from the base, and then texture the clay underneath using a circular motion. You can also use some water to soften the surface, which makes it a bit easier. But once again, Daiso Clay is so dry that everything is basically crumbling apart, and this wasn't very satisfying to do. However, because of the innate fluffy texture, the final result actually looks surprisingly realistic. And lastly, it's time to do the flower petal test. Making fake flowers is the ultimate test for the quality of a paper clay because it should be silky enough to spread as thin as paper but still hold its shape without breaking. Most cheaper brands of clay fail this test, and not surprisingly, Daiso Clay didn't do well. The edges start to fray outwards, and it's really hard to get a clean shape. Now let's move on to the Banggood paper clay. After taking this out, it feels quite similar to Mermaid Puffy, which I used in many of my older clay tutorials. I find it slightly silkier than Mermaid Puffy, and it mixes perfectly with acrylic paint. This also didn't turn sticky on my gloves, and when you pull it apart, it looks shockingly similar to cloud slime. Just like before, I'm going to use an egg cup to create the macaron shell. I noticed that this clay is incredibly elastic and there wasn't a single crack on it. However, it's more water resistant than most paper clays, making it slightly harder to texture if the surface has already started to dry. Though if you work quickly and use lots of water, then you should be able to get a very good result like this. Now moving on to the flower petal test. I was seriously impressed by this one because the clay flattens out perfectly and it also picks up the texture from your skin. This is a small detail that makes clay flowers look even more realistic, and it's something that's normally only possible with the most expensive brands. For the third and final comparison, I'm going to try making my own paper clay. On the box for Daiso, the ingredients are listed as microcapsules, natural fiber, water, and synthesis glue. I have no idea what microcapsules are, but the other two are basically paper fibers and PVA glue. The secret ingredient I'm going to use is cotton cellulose, which is basically a fine powder designed for making paper. Lisa from the German Cute Life Hacks channel bought this as part of her experiment to make the perfect cloud slime. If you want to watch that video, then I've linked it right here, though please note it is in German. When I saw this at Lisa's place, my first thought was that this must be the same thing they put inside paper clay, so we have to try out our own experiment. First of all, I'm simply going to try mixing all the ingredients together. I added 2 spoonfuls of cellulose, followed by glue and water. Then I played around a bit with the ingredients until everything formed a ball. So this mixture came together okay, but it's definitely not a clay. It's basically a dough that crumbles apart when you press into it. Lots of people tend to confuse Play-Doh with modeling clay, and they're both actually very different. Play-Doh is basically any mixture you can squish around, so it's much easier to make, and I even have a video with 10 different recipes here. Modeling clay is much trickier to create from scratch, since it needs to hold its shape when sculpted and dry without breaking. As you can see here, this mixture is definitely not a clay because it simply falls apart if you try to sculpt with it. For my second attempt, I had a hunch that you might be able to add borax to the glue so you get a slightly slime-like texture. Slimes are stretchy, and the clip from earlier proves that soft paper clay looks almost exactly like cloud slime. This time I mixed together a paste using cellulose and glue, and then I tried adding slime activator to that. But sadly, this ended up too soft and became more like a very thick butter slime. This was no good since it couldn't hold the shape at all, and you can't use this as modeling clay. For the final attempt, I simply decided to make a fluffy slime and then add a ton of cellulose fibers inside. To my amazement, this actually produced something that looks closest to real paper clay. You can see for yourself right here. When you press or pull on it, it creates these fluffy bits that look just like store-bought paper clay. It's also easy to mix paint inside, and the clay didn't stick to my gloves. This DIY clay was also great for the macaron test because it doesn't crack at all when you press on it, and it's easy and satisfying to texture. This actually dries a bit slower than the other clays, so you have more time to work and it makes everything a bit easier. I was also really impressed by the flower petal test, especially considering that the first 2 attempts ended up as complete fails. This was easy to smooth out and held its shape surprisingly well. At this point, I'm thinking this DIY clay is almost too good to be true, so I'm going to let everything dry overnight and give my final verdict the next day. So from top to bottom, these are Daiso Clay, Banggood paper clay, and DIY paper clay. The Daiso Clay is completely dry and feels the lightest out of all three. The Macaron texture looks quite realistic, however there are lots of tiny cracks along the top. I generally find Daiso Clay quite difficult to work with because it's so crumbly, so I wouldn't recommend it for detailed crafting. I think this one is much better left to just making slime with. So next up, the Banggood paper clay is also completely dry and it has a smooth, silky surface similar to Hearty Soft or Claycraft Deco. There are no cracks at all and the macaron looks incredibly realistic. I also wanted to add that the smell for all three clays were surprisingly fine, and this is one of my weird pet peeves since I really notice the smell of clay when working and it often bothers me. Moving on to the last one, I really had high hopes for my DIY paper clay, but sadly this one failed during the drying process. It ended up with several cracks, which was very disappointing, and I'm not sure if this might be because I used shaving foam in the slime, so I definitely want to retest this recipe in future. This one is only about 60% dry and it feels surprisingly heavy despite being made with paper fibers. It actually reminds me a bit of the two worst quality clays from the first video, however this one is definitely much easier to work with when it's soft. Making my own clay was still a very interesting experiment and I think this recipe has a lot of potential. And now let's take a quick look at the dried flower petals. The Daiso one has a nice texture, but it's still a fail since you can't get any clean edges. The Banggood paper clay turned out to be surprisingly flexible when dry. You can even bend this in half and it's amazing because it means you can make incredibly delicate flowers or leaves. In contrast, the DIY paper clay feels quite brittle and I'm sure that this is just going to break if I try to press on it. So in conclusion, the best clay out of all three is the Chinese paper clay, and I've included a shopping link and a discount code below. I'd personally recommend getting at least the white and brown clays. The reason for this is because it's difficult to create dark colors using paint and you'll end up using so much that it changes the texture of your clay. So I always prefer keeping a dark clay around just in case and then mixing the other colors using white clay and paint. However, if you do plan to make a lot of pastel colored pieces such as macarons or cakes, then by all means get the other clay colors as well because that'll save you a lot of time. So now let's start the final part of this video, which is a clay tutorial with these macaron shells. I'm going to be using the Banggood paper clay, however this tutorial works perfectly fine with any of the clays from this video, or of course polymer clay as well. If you decide to use polymer clay, then be sure to follow the correct baking instructions. First, take your shells and find the side that looks nicest. This is the one that should always be facing front. Make one ball of white clay for the face and then add 2 ears. These pieces should have a slightly uneven surface since they're supposed to look like milk cream. Now take some chocolate colored clay and push it through a piping tip. Arrange this to fill up the rest of the macaron shell and place the lid on top. If the clay isn't sticking properly at any point, then you can always use water or white glue to help. The best thing is to leave this to dry for a bit so you don't accidentally squash the texture of the chocolate cream. This is what actually happened to me, so if you can, make sure everything is fairly dry before moving on to the next step. I'm going to use Deco sauce for the facial features, which is a fake chocolate sauce that dries slightly shiny. However, you can always use tiny pieces of brown clay, acrylic paint, or nail polish instead. Then take a toothpick and carefully paint on the facial features. I'm using the same koala design from my squishy video, and many people told me that this looks like Koala from BT21. I completely agree and I love how he looks, so I'm going to be doing a special BTS DIY compilation soon. If you're ARMY, then let me know down below what your favorite mascots from BT21 are. Lastly, I'm going to use some real blusher and a cotton bud to make cute looking cheeks. If your clay is already dry, then you can brush a tiny bit of white glue over it to make sure the pigment sticks. Of course, you can also use pastel powder or eyeshadow for this. This type of macaron is called Ispanhan and it was also the inspiration behind one of my earliest clay videos here. Lots of people still love making this DIY, which I can see from all of your tags on Instagram. So please be sure to follow me there and tag me on your pictures so I can see your work. So I hope you enjoyed this video and feel inspired to do some clay crafting. All the supplies I used are linked down below along with some discount codes. This is Joanna, thank you so much for watching and I'll see you soon. Bye!